The following is a message from Christ Central Manchester, a church that meets in the heart of Manchester in the UK. To find out more about us, please visit www.christcentral.org.uk.
Okay, I'm on. Good morning. For those who don't know me, my name is Josh. I've been at Christ Central for about 5 to 6 years, I think now. It was when I was in my first year of uni. I help lead the youth here along with my wife Laura, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the parable of the rich fool. So, I'll just start my timer. Right, so just to lay a bit of an intro down, there are about 800 passages in the New and Old Testament talking about wealth, possessions, and giving. And Jesus, as a teacher, spent about 25% of his time talking about possessions and wealth. However, I want to make it clear, I believe strongly if preachers in today's society spent 25% of their time talking about money, there'd probably be no one left at church. So even though Jesus did it a lot, it's not necessarily talked about as much nowadays. So here in the UK, we are doing okay in a worldly context. We have supermarkets with everything we need. We have convenience stores on every shop corner. We have access to the internet. We have TVs. We have more electronics. And compared to the rest of the world, we're doing pretty well. However, despite all that, we are going through now arguably pretty tough economic times. I mean, if you listen to the media, the rich will blame the poor. The rich will say, well, the poor are killing us because they're lazy. They want everything for nothing. And they're just taking our money so we can't run our businesses, and the media would let you believe that the poor say about the rich, well, you rip us off, it's corporate fraud and greed, why don't you pay more taxes? And then every 5 years we hear it's all Labour's fault or it's all the Tories' fault, and every now and again people will unite and blame something new like the EU. So, it's in society like this that revolves so heavily around wealth that Jesus cuts through and speaks with words of eternal wisdom. Luke 12 verses 15, a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. So we're going to read the verse together. If you can turn to Luke chapter 12, verses 13 in your Bibles. We're going to have it here on the screen. I'm going to read it off the screen with you. And we're just going to have a quick look through the verse before I talk about it. So, Luke 12, verse 13 to 21. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool. This very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves but is not rich towards God." Okay, so just to set some context, because I believe that's really important when we're looking at the scriptures to know what was going on at the time. Jesus at this point had established a huge following. He had thousands of people following every day, listening to every word. He had literally just been talking about some pretty serious stuff in the verses beforehand. He'd just been talking about hell. So, for example, if you look to verse 4 really quickly, it says, "I tell you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, and after that can do no more, but I will show you whom you should fear. Fear him who, after your body has been killed, has authority to throw you into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him." Pretty intense. And it's at this point, so Jesus is in full flow talking about this, that somebody in the crowd shouts out to Jesus, "Tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." So for me as a teacher, I used to experience this a lot. I'd be talking full force about something, it might have been vectors, scalars, something really boring. I see someone put their hand up and I'm like, oh, I'm sure they've got a really relevant question. They put their hand up and ask me what it's like to go to the toilet in space. So for me, completely off topic, nothing to do with what I'm talking about, but I have to make the decision at that point whether to humour them or take it back to where it was. And for me, it's also quite comforting that Jesus, the greatest teacher of all time, we still follow his teachings today, still had to deal with people trying to throw him off topic and throw what I call curveballs at him. So this guy is basically saying, yeah, all that hell stuff is really scary, thanks for the heads up, but I want to talk about money. And apparently this young man is the younger of two brothers, and he is worried that now that his father's dead, he is going to get less than he believes he is entitled to receive of the inheritance. So this kind of brings us towards my first point of today. So for anyone taking notes, I have 3 points. They're going to be up on the screen behind me. And my first point is simply called greed. So to be fair to this guy, I can relate. I'm sure that we all spend a lot of our time thinking about money and possessions. And in all honesty, I'm sure we spend a lot of time talking to God about money and possessions. So it's easy to judge him, but we've all been there. Just on a side note before I get into it, I do believe this can happen a lot. We come to church so preoccupied with an issue that we've been suffering from earlier in the week, and we bring it through the door with us. And there might be an amazing contribution from the congregation or a preach which is aimed directly at an area in your life that you need wisdom, and you're so preoccupied with that thing that you've brought in with you that you end up missing it completely and focusing only on what you've brought through the door. So I really encourage you this morning, even if you don't feel you have any issues to do with greed or finances or wealth, that there might be something here today that you can really take away with you. So, back to greed. We have a guy who's just lost his father, and instead of mourning and spending time with his family, he is trying to get Jesus to sort out his finances. If you look at some translations, in fact most translations, it uses the word covet, but I like to use the word greed because I feel it's more relevant today and people know what greed means. Plain and simply, greed is a sin. Exodus 20 verse 17 says, "You shall not covet your neighbour's wife, car and house." I don't know about anyone else, but whenever I used to hear verses that mentioned neighbour when I was young, I used to directly think it meant my neighbour. So I always used to go home and think, why do I want that? That's a bit weird. But it's just neighbour is a general context, obviously. So, greed is not just having possessions, but it's the loving of possessions. In other words, it's materialism. It results in the owning of more and more possessions, resulting in the non-stop desire and need for more possessions. And not things that you need, but things that you just feel you have to have, things that your life won't be happy again until you have it. I mean, advertising nowadays is absolutely mental. Advertising is designed purely to make you discontent with your current life situation. How many times have you sat watching television, sat on your computer, and seen an advert pop up and instantly realised that your life is not complete? You instantly realise that until that object that you've just seen on the screen, that you didn't know existed until 30 seconds ago, is either on your driveway, in your front room, on your feet, your life will not be complete again. So, I know I'm sure you all have, it happens quite a lot. In fact, the whole point of shopping centres like the Trafford Centre, for example, is to make that whole situation easy for you. You can walk around not worrying about the weather, not worrying about what's going on, literally going window to window, buying things you don't necessarily need. For me, I used to be a teacher, but I've recently changed career. I'm now working for Decathlon, the sports company. I manage the bike side of the Bolton business. It's something I'm really enjoying. And we had a customer come in a couple of weeks ago. He was buying two bikes, two really expensive bikes, and he decided, after he'd ordered the bikes, that he wanted to have some mudguards fitted. So mudguards, for anyone who doesn't know bikes, are the flaps that sit on top of your wheels and stop you getting splashed by water and mud, things like that. So unfortunately, he picked the most awkward mudguards to fit, so my poor mechanic said, right, it's going to take you about 30 minutes to fit these. If you come back, maybe you want to go to Costa next door, have a coffee. But he said, no, it's all right, I'll go and look around the store, I've never been here before. 15 minutes later, he comes back and in quite an accusatory way says, because of you guys, I've just gone and spent another £50 on items that I didn't even know I needed. Thanks for that. So obviously, from a business point of view, we thought maybe we should take 2 hours to fit the mudguards, but we didn't. So I went off to the office to do some admin stuff, got on with what I was doing, and luckily I came out of the office just as I saw this guy leaving, and not only did he have his 2 bikes, 3 baskets of stuff, he also had 2 of my employees walking behind him, carrying a £400 inflatable kayak. So I don't know where this guy's going, I don't know what he's doing, but it happens quite a lot. People see stuff, decide they need it, they don't really. It's greed. However, for example, I am no better. It's important to say. I know that I have, and my family and Laura will back this up, I have an extremely obsessive, passionate personality. And when I see something, I have to pursue it until I have it. Obviously, in some situations, this is good. Laura. But this has also led to me having many things over the years that have sat collecting dust. So when I was going through my notes with Laura, I got to this point, and I turned with a really serious and sincere face to Laura and said, can you think of any examples of when I've asked for something and not used it? She kind of turned to me with a smirk, put a hand up like this, and labelled a present from every single birthday and Christmas for the last 3 years that she's bought for me that I've literally touched maybe once or twice. So it's real for me, and I'm sure it's real for you. We all do it. Yes. Just like a boxing punch bag, a few bikes, quite a lot of stuff anyway. Telescope, that was a good one. I do like space, but... Okay, materialism itself, however, can actually bind you from materialism. It can be hard to spot if you are greedy. I mean, it's not as obvious as other sins. You don't go out purposely cheat on your spouse and then think, wait a minute, is this adultery? What am I doing here? And in the same way, you don't go out, kill someone, stand in court, and when they put you in prison for murder, go, oh, that's what murder is. It's pretty obvious. It's pretty obvious when you're committing certain sins. However, the fact is with greed, quite a lot of the time, it's hard to spot, and as a result, it's quite hard to confess it. So, it is very common in today's society to think of rich people when we think of greed. We tend to equate richness to greediness. So we might sit and look at these videos of footballers living these crazy lives thinking, oh, look at all that stuff, look how greedy they are. And we don't apply it to ourselves. We don't think that's true because they've got more stuff than us, they must be greedier than us. It actually says in Colossians 3 verse 5, put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. So plain and simply, greed is idolatry. We make things idols and we treasure them above other things, including God. So Tim Keller, a really prominent theologist and teacher, I really like his stuff, talks about there being two different categories of idols. He talks about deep idols and surface idols. So for example, in this context, the surface idol may be the riches and possessions, they look like they're really well off. But the deep idol, the underlying need, this greed, comes from the need for status. They like the fact that their money gives them a certain power, it allows them to move in certain social groups, social situations. Another example, maybe on the surface they look rich, but deep down the deep idol might be security. As in they like the fact that they have a store of money ready if anything goes wrong, if somebody in their family gets ill, if their house suffers ruin, anything like that. It's that deep down need to know that if anything goes wrong, I can sort myself out. But ultimately, when you do that, are you really putting your trust in God? If you think I need money for every situation, where's God come into that? So I heard a really good example about two teenage girls. They went off to university. Their parents were Christians. They went off to university, became Christians, really on fire for God, really excited to go. And they both separately heard from God that they were being called to go to Africa as missionaries. So they went back to their parents, all excited, who were Christians, really happy to see them come back, and said, Mum, Dad, guess what? We've become Christians. Brilliant. God's called us to Africa. Ugh. The parents basically turned to them and said, guys, that's really great, that's really good, but do you not think it would be better to, once you finished your degree, I mean, the job market's really tough at the moment, why don't you do a master's as well? After that, maybe go and get a few years of work under your belt, give yourself that financial security, maybe even find a husband, have some kids to give yourself that family support network. And what the parents were basically trying to do is create that security for their kids. They thought, the best thing I can do here is set them up for life, and then nothing can go wrong. So they went back to their church leader, told them what the parents had said, quite deflated. And the church leader turned around and said to them, he said, look, you're living on a ball of rock which is flying through space at 1,000 miles an hour. If that comes into contact with any other celestial bodies, we're gone. We live in a world where world leaders have access to nuclear weapons, we have climate change, we have all sorts going on. Is there really any security? And in honesty, there isn't, no. So can money protect us from those things? No, it can't. We need to put our trust in God. Another deep idol, and my final one, is comfort. Much like the guy in the parable, I just want to be happy and have lots of stuff. I don't want to need for anything. I don't want to desire anything. I want everything that I want to be here in front of me right now. So, to bring my first point about greed to a close, Jesus tells the man that the most important thing is not for him to solve his inheritance problem, but that his heart be changed. If we're honest, how often have we gone to God asking him to change our situation rather than asking him to change our heart? I would dare say that most of our prayers are that God would solve a problem in our lives, when in reality, perhaps our prayers should be, God, here is my problem, please change my heart. I know I need to do that. Thank you. So, point 2, foolish. Point 2 is labelled foolish. So, Jesus, being the great teacher that he was, then decided to take this opportunity to teach all of the crowds what it means to be foolish with your wealth. So to summarize the parable, a guy's doing really well financially. He thinks to himself, what should I do? I know I'll build some barns, store up some more wealth, and then I'll live a nice, comfortable, happy life. The important thing to add in here is that the man, as far as we know, committed absolutely no sin whatsoever in gaining his wealth. And that's a very important point to make. There is nothing sinful about being successful in your business and workplace, and as a result, obtaining high levels of wealth. For it is only through God's grace that he will allow you to be successful in the first place. That's a really important point to make. But at the end of the day, this guy is a fool. It's called the parable of the rich fool. It says in the scripture, and if God calls a man a fool, then I'm not going to argue it. So let's break down the foolish deeds of this man and see if we can avoid making the same mistakes. So I'm going to make 3 ways in which we can avoid being foolish. So the first way that this man was foolish was not giving God the credit. So if you notice the wording in the verse, it says, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest." So whilst it's true that the man probably worked really hard for his harvest, he probably had to get up from dawn till dusk, chopping the crops down and storing it away, it's pretty clear from the wording of the verse that if there had been a famine or a drought or the man had suffered an illness, he could have just as easily had a really poor harvest. It was only because of the grace and the blessing of God that he was able to obtain this really good harvest. However, he sees only the work of his own hand and not the hand of God, which is an easy trap to fall into. So I ask you, how many times in our lives have we achieved something or had some success and not given God the credit he is due? God doesn't need our credit. He's the creator of the universe, all-powerful, all-knowing, but he is in an intimate relationship with us, and it is only through his blessings that we have success in the first place, and that's really important to remember. The second foolish deed that this man committed was he left God out of his plans, and we do it all the time. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my extra grain." So here the main issue is the rich man's continued reference to himself. Notice in that simple 2 verses alone, he says, I, I'll, I, and I. 5 times he talks about himself and doesn't once mention God. He doesn't include God in his thought process and when he's making his plans. And there's also no reference to others when deciding where to keep all of his extra grain. There is nothing wrong with the desire to build more barns, to have a bit of security. It is in reality a fairly wise decision to an extent. The problem lays in the fact that there is absolutely no thought of sharing whatsoever. It is all focused on him and himself. So, quick show of hands. Who here has watched the show Storage Hunters? Good. Okay, so for anyone who hasn't seen it, watch it. It's an American concept originally. It has now come to the UK. The same guys come over to do it. But basically, the idea of the show is that you have these storage containers that people have stopped paying their rent for, and as a result, they can now be sold to punters. So these guys come along with their colourful personalities and basically bid on these storage containers without actually knowing what's inside. I mean, they get a close look, but they don't get to actually find out what it is. And they bid in the hope that the things that they bid for will actually turn out to be financially profitable to them. So just to give you a bit of a context, there are double the amount of storage facilities in the US than Starbucks and McDonald's combined and doubled, which is pretty crazy. I mean, the concept of storage is fine. You're in between houses, have a new business startup, or need a workplace. But the reality is that they are just a symptom of the greedy society that we live in. It's just stuff that we clearly don't need at that moment, and in the case of the show, that they didn't need at all, so much so that they stopped paying their rent for it and it got given away. People decide to store it away rather than think of how it could be helpful to others. And that's what the fool does here. He doesn't ask for God's help in making the decision, and as a result comes to a conclusion that is selfish and will only benefit him. I will store my surplus stuff away so that I have it in the future if I fall on hard times. He, and I'm sure we, forget that wealth and possessions are not actually ours. I mean, they may belong to us, but they don't belong to us in an eternal sense. We are merely stewards and loaning it from God. So all your money and possessions that you have, you are just looking after it for God. Quite a common thought process is, if God gave me a lot of money, I would be so much more generous. If I had what those footballers are earning, I'd be giving so much of it to charity. But I can say to you quite clearly, if you're not generous with what you have now, then you're not going to be generous when you have a lot of money. The Bible says, he who is entrusted with a little can be trusted with much. He who is trustworthy with a little bit of resources can be entrusted with more resources. So if you can't handle what God has given you now, who's to say that you'd be able to handle it if he gave you more? And I'm not saying this is really important, that we give away in order to get, but we want to be good stewards. And good stewards are most likely to have God entrust more to their stewardship. It's not how much you get, it's how much you keep. It's what you do with what you get, and what's your heart's motivation with your consumption. So the third foolish deed that I'd like to talk about is this guy decides to live only in the moment. And I use live loosely, as you can see. So I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. So living only in the moment. So when the man was making these plans, he was planning and making these plans under the pretense that he would continue to sustain his good level of crops. He thought it's going well now, it's going to go well in the future. God's blessing me now, he'll continue to bless me. He thought that he was set for a future of prosperity, however, he could have not been more wrong. In James 4, verses 13 to 16, these aren't up on the screen, so I'll just read it to you. And these are pretty hard-hitting verses. Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow, we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, and we will live and do this or that, as it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. So I want to clarify here that there is nothing wrong with making plans and preparing for the future. It's a wise thing to do. And it's not wrong to make these plans and expectations with an expectation of success and blessing from God. However, when we do this, we need to ensure that we are clear that ultimately God is in charge of our life, and our situation can change just like that. So after all these foolish actions and a lot of bad decisions, what does God do? He kills the man. This guy goes from in one night planning a lifetime of comfort and earthly riches to instead being stood before his Maker and being accountable for his actions. His account, when he speaks to God and stands there in front of him, will be an account of selfishness and greed. He was ultimately foolish, and God took his life away. So, I'm going to move on to my final point, and then I'm going to come to a conclusion, and this kind of sums up everything that I've said so far. So, do we worship wealth, or do we worship God? The final verse says, this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. So it's clear that we can be financially rich and spiritually poor towards God. I mean, you look at some of the people out there, some of the millionaires, the way that they act. Me and Keith talked about Mike Ashley as an example. Obviously not a great guy, but he's got a lot of money, but he's not acting spiritually rich towards God, he's acting spiritually poor. So when I say spiritually poor towards God, I mean we owe him a debt. And not a monetary debt, a different kind of debt. Every time we sin, we store up debt to God. And it's quite easy when we stop and think for a moment, even if you did it now, how huge that debt is even daily, even since this morning. Think about all the wrong things. So, Laura and I have been married for nearly 2 years now, July 25th. And in our first year, thanks to the generosity of our parents, our friends, and the fact that I was in a comfortable full-time job, we had a really nice, comfortable first year. We were able to furnish our house, we were able to have a nice time, and it was really enjoyable, and it's just as enjoyable now. But at the end of my first year of being married and teaching, so it was probably my third year of teaching, I think, I decided that I wanted to try something new. I decided that I either wanted to move to a new school or I wanted to try a new career. So I handed in my notice at the school I was at, which was quite a big step for me, and basically decided to become a supply teacher for a bit. So for anyone who doesn't know supply teaching, it's literally a day-to-day thing. You get a call in the morning, they say, can you go to this school and teach this subject? And you say yes or no. And I thought with there being a shortage of science teachers, and particularly physics teachers, I'd be absolutely fine. So 1st of September, 7 a.m, get up, get ready for work, already looking smart, no phone call comes. Pretty sad. Second day, exactly the same thing happens again. And this actually went on in September for weeks and weeks. And to me, it was a big shock. It was really tough, because not only was I bored, I wasn't working, I was sat at home, I just had a 6-week summer, I was ready to get going again. Also, it was starting to get towards the time where we had to pay our bills again, and our rent and things like that. And to me, I'd never worried about that before, because we were fine, but then when these bills started coming through, and obviously we're very lucky that we pay our rent and our car bills to people who are very generous, but it was a time of worry for me. It was a time that every time it got around to that period of the month, I started to get quite anxious about it, and I didn't know what to do. And I just want you to imagine for a moment, imagine if instead of getting a bill every month that is monetary, that you can pay back every month so it stays small, imagine every month receiving a bill that not only lists all the sins you've committed, but the thought processes and the motives behind them. And it's important to point out that you can't pay off this bill. This bill just stacks and stacks, day after day, month after month, year after year. It'd get to a point where this bill is so big, so long, that you can't even keep track of it anymore and you decide to ignore it. Then imagine that you get to a point where you are literally feeling like there's hell to pay, it can't get any worse, and you get a completely blank bill through the post. And all it says at the bottom is, all debts paid and future debts paid, sincerely, Jesus. Obviously, I think you'd sign it a bit more lovingly than that, but I was just trying to make a point. So, to put it plain and simply, this is what Jesus did. This is getting towards my conclusion now. This is what Jesus did. The Son of God, creator of the heavens and the earth, was living up in heaven with all the richness we could possibly imagine and more. He became a man. He became poor and lived the perfect, sinless life. His bill would have been nothing every single month. He did all this so that he could die a terrible and painful death at the cross, which we've been remembering this morning with communion, purely to wipe our bill clean, to take it completely away. He gave himself as the ransom. We all know what ransom means. Giving money for someone's life for all of our sins, and paid it well and truly in full. And I mean in full. He paid all of it. So, all we, as humans living on this earth, have to do to receive this all-encompassing, amazing cleaning of our slate is to put our faith in him. As soon as you place your faith in Jesus and begin an intimate relationship with him, you become spiritually debt-free and become rich towards God. So, you may still, after you become a Christian, have your earthly riches, or you may not. But if you are faithful to him, then you are rich towards God. And at the end of the day, at the end of your life, when you're stood before your Maker, which is more important? The earthly riches you leave behind, or what you've stored up for yourself in heaven? If we can live with this eternity mindset and be aware of our riches waiting for us in heaven, then we can also be rich towards God financially while we're here on earth. We can live with a generosity theology. And what I mean by that is, we can think, I want to take care of my family. I want to help look after my church. I want to help the poor, help those in need. I want to live a life that leaves a lasting legacy of generosity and kindness. And then at that point, when we are stood before God, stood before our Maker, the creator of the heavens and earth, right where that rich fool stood, and where he so kind of humbly failed, we can say with confidence, I tried my best not to be greedy. I tried to give you the credit. I tried to include you in my plans, to not live in the moment, and most of all, worship you. We have a huge opportunity in this lifetime, and we need to remind ourselves of that daily. So I'm going to finish there. I'm going to hand over to Keith, and we're probably going to do something different.